Tonight, no compromise. Russian President Vladimir Putin's response to new U.S. sanctions on Russia.
We've cut off Russia's government from Western financing. It can no longer raise money from the West.
As the Russian military begins its invasion into Ukraine.
Plus, threats from domestic terrorism.
I'm shaken up. It was a surreal experience.
The danger for public officials, universities, and churches.
And uncovering the oldest black church in America.
It was a time when they weren't supposed to be worshiping together. That was a big risk.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
A somber warning from the Pentagon cautioning Putin's nearly 200,000 troops ready to go if the Russian leader gives the order. Welcome to Faith Nation in Washington. I'm Jenna Browder.
Good evening. I'm John Jessup. A 30-day state of emergency after a Russian military invasion. Ukraine's government now urging all Ukrainian citizens to leave Russia before war possibly breaks out.
Other nations following suit with sanctions of their own after yesterday's first round imposed by the United States. President Biden promising more penalties to come if Vladimir Putin doesn't stand down. The CBN's Brody Carter is following the developments and joins us with tonight's top story. Brody?
John, Jenna, the U.S. has announced another round of economic sanctions after President Putin began his invasion. New actions target the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, connecting natural gas between Russia and Germany, as the world waits for what Washington calls an imminent full-scale invasion. Ukraine continues fighting off cyber attacks, and Russian forces now breaching its eastern border.
It could take place tomorrow. It could take place next week. It could take place before the end of the Olympics. It could take place after the Olympics. I want to be very clear. Our concern has not diminished an iota. And in fact, our concern continues to grow.
Ukraine has vowed to defend itself after Russia started its land grab operation in the Donbass region, where rebel forces already control about a third of that land. CBN's George Thomas reporting those provinces are seeing a heavy uptick of fighting, with thousands of ceasefire violations. A new parliamentary law allows Ukrainian civilians to carry weapons, preparing for Putin's next steps. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling up some 250,000 military reservists as new satellite images show Moscow deploying more troops to Belarus and Western Russia.
Over the past several weeks, we've also seen Russian officials and Russian media plant numerous stories in the press, any one of which could be elevated to serve as a pretext for an invasion. This could happen, we are concerned, at any time.
Regarding sanctions, Putin said Americans will feel the consequences. After Biden moved ahead with the first wave of sanctions, American and European sanctions will target the Duma, Putin's inner circle, and Russian banks. Lithuania, Poland, Australia, and Japan were quick to respond with their own punitive actions. President Biden, hoping to limit economic disruptions, did acknowledge that these sanctions will also impact Americans at the gas pump. Today, an evacuation at the Russian consulate in Ukraine forewarned of further Russian aggression, as refugees gather near the border of Poland for a quick escape. 800 American troops backed by Allied fighter jets and helicopters are being repositioned to support NATO countries in the Baltic states. The Pentagon says more U.S. troops could head to Europe should there be a need. John, Jenna, back to you.
All right, Brody Carter, thank you very much. And here with us now, Marshall Billingsley, former Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing at the Treasury Department under President Trump. And he's also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Marshall, welcome. It's great to have you with us this evening. So essentially, you were the person at the Treasury who came up with and imposed sanctions on our adversaries. On these newest sanctions against Russia, critics feel they are not strong enough. What do you think?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, Jenna and John. Thanks for having me. I probably would be in that camp of those who say that this is really still too little too late. I do think President Biden deserves credit for how he has held the NATO alliance together. He's kept Germany and France on the reservation, and he's done, I think, a very good job in mobilizing other allies, such as Japan and Australia, to join with us in sanctions. The problem is that the measures that he's adopted so far are not deterring Vladimir Putin, and President Biden he remains too cautious. Now is the time, if we're going to avoid a massive war in Europe. Now's the time to act.
What economic measures do you think the U.S. and our allies need to take against Russia?
Well, we need to start with basically 3 sets of actions when we should have done this yesterday. Obviously, the sanctions against Putin's inner circle, the so-called oligarchs who have profited, they've enriched themselves at the expense of the Russian people under Putin's patronage. We need to target their finances. So far, the oligarchs that have been targeted are largely ones that have already been sanctioned under the Trump administration during my watch. Secondly, we need to target significant sectors of the Russian economy that Putin relies on to generate hard currency for his war machine. Targeting 1 or 2 banks here and there, especially banks that we've, again, already sanctioned in 2014, does very little in that respect. But significant broad-reaching financial sanctions and sanctions on certain Russian exports like timber and metals, that would get Putin's attention.
Marshall, as you well know, Germany is halting the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in response to the Kremlin's recognition of the Donbass as independent states. How significant, first of all, is that for Russia? And secondly, even though President Biden received criticism for waiving sanctions on that pipeline last year, has that, in hindsight, provided additional leverage for the current conflict?
No, not really, because, first of all, it's the right thing to do, and I'm glad Germany has done it. I'm glad that President Biden has finally gotten around today to implementing the sanctions that Senator Cruz was asking for and against which the Biden administration lobbied ferociously last month. President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has begged us to sanction the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But the reality is that no gas was flowing through that pipeline yet. The gas still flows through the existing pipeline, which does traverse Ukraine. So this is good, but it's not going to deter Putin.
New polling from the AP and NORC finds just 26% of Americans say the U.S. should play a major role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That in mind, Marshall, why is this an issue America should care about?
Well, I think there are 2 reasons that all Americans should care about and should talk about this at the kitchen table. But let's be clear, no one is advocating for military intervention on the part of the United States. Ukraine is not a NATO ally, and we are not pledged to fight and defend them the way we are the other NATO allies that are on Russia's border. That said, I would start with the basic principle that President Reagan so famously articulated: the United States as a city upon a hill, as a beacon of freedom. Of course, he was borrowing that turn of phrase from the Sermon on the Mount, but what he was talking about is the fact that we have served as a light for freedom-seeking peoples everywhere, and we should continue to do so.
Marshall, unfortunately, we are out of time. Marshall Billingsley with the Hudson Institute, thank you so much for being with us and your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, here at home, a top official with decades of experience in Homeland Security describes America's current threat environment as the worst he's seen in 30 years.
He specifically warns that churches, universities, and public officials are special targets. One politician recently targeted in Kentucky. Here's senior national affairs correspondent Heather Sells.
Last week, a mayoral candidate in Louisville, Kentucky, became the latest target in what Homeland Security calls a rapidly growing domestic terror threat. The alleged gunman, a city council candidate and racial justice activist, walked into Craig Greenberg's campaign office and shot at him before his team barricaded the door.
I'm shaken up. It was a surreal experience, and mostly right now, I just want to get home to my wife and sons and give them a hug.
The shooting comes just weeks after a gunman in North Texas took 4 hostages at a synagogue.
The threat environment is probably the most volatile and dynamic that I've experienced in my 35-plus year career.
On Tuesday, a top counterterrorism official warned that violence spurred by domestic and foreign actors is spiking. Both Louisville and North Texas fit that pattern.
This is a threat environment that has become intermingled, right, where multiple ideologies can be commingled.
Mr. Greenberg is Jewish, so there's that. We don't know if it's tied to the candidate, political, or if it's just, are we dealing with someone who has mental issues?
At the synagogue, Cohen says the British gunman identified with ISIS and also as anti-vax and anti-government. Cohen says that certain online political narratives are fueling extremists, but defended Homeland Security against critics who fear that threat assessments can trample on First Amendment rights.
Our job's not to police thought. Our job is to prevent acts of violence.
And he warned of specific threats against houses of worship, plus universities, government officials, and drug companies.
There's a level of anger out there. It's the anger is being stoked by threat actors.
Well, I think churches should be well aware that they're a target.
Church security expert Ron Aguiar says history shows a pattern of lone wolves attacking churches.
You can go back in the last 20 or 30 years in violence at churches. It's been one person. In America, in the U.S.
To prevent or mitigate attacks, faith communities can access government grants to bolster security. And experts say churches should work closely with police. At a deeper level, says Cohen, the challenge is for the country to stop demonizing political opponents and refuse to accept political violence. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Thank you, Heather. Coming up, a convoy of tractor trailers make their way to the nation's capital ahead of next week's State of the Union address. Welcome back. The makers of a new COVID vaccine are claiming 100% efficacy against severe disease and hospitalizations. The drug manufacturers Sanofi and GlaxoSmithKline say 2 doses are needed to receive 100% protection from COVID's worst outcomes. The Europe-based pharmaceutical companies also say their new vaccine is 75% effective against moderate to severe disease. Sanofi GSK plans to submit the new shots for authorization in the United States and Europe.
Well, Truckers Unite. Thousands of truckers are heading to Washington, D.C. over the next several days. Men and women from around the country gathering in California this morning to form a convoy.
What we're looking for is to end the declaration of emergency, the emergency declaration, to end the mandates on the vaccine and the mask mandates, especially for our healthcare workers, our law enforcement officers, our federal employees, and of course our military personnel.
A group from Pennsylvania is also planning to join them heading south on Interstate 81 from Scranton. Police in the district are preparing for a major traffic disruption this week after weeks of protest in Canada. Some drivers plan to arrive in time for the president's State of the Union address happening Tuesday. Security around the Capitol is ramping up, with 800 National Guard troops expected to be deployed ahead of the speech. In addition to COVID restrictions, convoy organizers say they're standing up against other things like skyrocketing gas prices and critical race theory. They insist the protest will be peaceful and hope it sends a message to the White House.
Here with us now is Tony Perkins, president of Family Research Council and host of Washington Watch. Tony, as Jenna was just saying, several groups plan to converge in Washington for the truck convoy in time for the president's State of the Union address next Tuesday. They say it's going to be a peaceful protest. Meanwhile, 800 National Guard troops have been called in to assist. I know that you had Mike Landis on your show from the People's Convoy yesterday on Washington Watch. Do you think this will remain peaceful, or might we see scenes like the ones that played out with our neighbors in the North, Canada?
Well, I think from the trucker standpoint and those that are advocating for freedom, I think it will be peaceful, depending on how the authorities respond to it. And maybe, you know, some might try to infiltrate. But John, here, and Jenna, this is the exciting thing. Freedom is on the roll. We're seeing it with truckers. We're seeing it in minivans with moms going to school board meetings. I'm at a hopeful point in America that we have people that said enough is enough, whether it's our children being indoctrinated in our schools or it's our freedoms being forced to wear these masks and get vaccinated against our will. It is time. And this is encouraging that the Americans still have the ability, but also the fortitude to peacefully demonstrate for our freedoms.
Tony, I want to talk to you about the Supreme Court. It's set to take up another case involving religious freedom and the rights of LGBTQ people. This one is over a Colorado graphic website designer who wants to post a statement on her website about her Christian beliefs, leading her to decline any request from a same-sex couple to design a wedding website. Is all of this all that different from the wedding cake case in which the Supreme Court ruled for the Colorado baker?
It's not really different. I mean, we see Colorado continuing to do this. The 10th Circuit, unfortunately, saying that the government here, in this case, had the authority to either force or compel or restrict the expression of these private employers or these private companies. And this is troubling because it's not just, well, we see them singling out religious convictions. It's not a far stretch to say this can begin to spill over into other areas. So every American should be concerned when you have government either restricting or forcing particular speech.
Tony, sticking with the Supreme Court here, President Biden reportedly has interviewed all the candidates for Justice Breyer's seat that opens upon his retirement at the conclusion of this term. An announcement is expected early next week. Tony, do you anticipate a big fight on the Hill over this nomination?
I would hope so, because I think we're going to see a nominee that is 180 degrees removed from what we saw in the previous nominations by former President Trump. President Biden, has been very clear. This is going to be an advocate for a Roe v. Wade, unrestricted abortion, and religious liberty is going to be in the crosshairs. Now, this is not going to change the balance of the court. You will continue with a conservative-leaning court. I am concerned that some Republicans may say, you know, it's not worth the fight, but I'm hopeful that they will stand in if this is a radical pick by President Biden, because this will, again, affect the midterm elections. It shows a clear contrast between the governing ideologies of the two parties.
All right, Tony Perkins with the Family Research Council. We have to leave it there tonight. Tony, thank you so much. It's great to see you, as always.
Good to be with you all.
Archaeologists still uncovering the oldest black church in America. A look at the new documentary coming out next.
Well, welcome back. Archaeologists in Williamsburg, Virginia are uncovering the oldest black church in America dating back to colonial times.
The rich history of First Baptist Church is now the subject of a documentary that producers say tells the whole story, not just half the story. Wendy Griffith explains.
Ringing a bell from the First Baptist Church in Virginia, one of the oldest black churches in America, founded under a grove of trees in 1776.
It's a story 245 years in the making. The story of black Americans, free and slaves, gathering in secret to pray and worship together.
It was a time when they weren't supposed to be worshiping together. That was a big risk, and they took that risk to fulfill their faith.
Producers say the documentary, History Half Told is Untold, tells the amazing story of how white colonist Jesse Cole gave black enslaved preacher Moses a small 16 by 20 foot carriage house for worship.
Sit down, down, sit down. Sit down and take your rest.
The story coming out of Bruton Parish is that Jesse Cole's wife loved the worship service that the blacks did so much. She would come home and open her window and enjoy the songs and the service. And the good thing about this is we found the descendants of that family, and the story is the same. So the parallel history integrates, and that's what we're trying to do with this film.
After a tornado destroyed it, a second church built on the site in 1856 stood for 100 years. The rich history of First Baptist, however, was literally covered up when the city put a parking lot over the land and paid for a new church building a few blocks away. Thanks to efforts by Colonial Williamsburg and the Let Freedom Ring Foundation, archaeologists began uncovering the history, and Harshaw says that is bringing healing.
You have some descendants right now that are still living that saw this process, this church at 1856 structure being knocked down and covered up with an asphalt parking lot. They're now getting to ride by and see it being uncovered.
And that's helping bring the community, black and white, together.
I want people to feel that healing can happen, that togetherness, it can happen. All of the things that we thought could not happen, all we have to do is come together and recognize each other's humanity and that we all serve the same God.
The goal is to reconstruct the 1818 church right here on the site of where archaeologists discovered the remnants of the original meeting house, which eventually became known as First Baptist Church.
It was probably a very lightly built structure, wooden siding that comes up from a brick foundation. We uncovered that several months ago, and it will not survive long being exposed to the elements like we're experiencing today. So we are backfilling it right now, and it will stay covered for the time being. And the hope and the expectation is that we will be able to rebuild that once the whole project is finished.
Important discoveries so far include a 1-cent coin dating back to 1817, copper pins common on women's clothing at the time, and about 30 grave sites. The dig is scheduled to continue through this year. Then work will begin on a reconstructed church. The goal, to open doors to the public by the fall of 2026, in time for the First Baptist 250th anniversary celebration. Wendy Griffith, CBN News, Williamsburg.
And you can see the documentary History Half Told is Untold, February 25th through the 27th at 8 p.m. on the CBN News Channel.
Can't wait to watch it. Coming up, remembering the life of a beautiful soul with a beautiful voice that inspires hope even in death. We'll be right back.
Finally tonight, after a brave battle with cancer, singer Jane Marcheski has died at the age of 31.
Known as Nightbird, she was a Christian student at Liberty University, but left, and not long after that, Jane developed breast cancer. She was certain she'd beat it, and she did, even releasing a song about it in 2019 called Girl in a Bubble. That's the music video you're seeing right there. But the cancer came back and spread. Her husband walked out on her. And Jane, though, made it big on America's Got Talent with an audition that's now been viewed more than 40 million times. You can read more about her life on cbnnews.com. Just a beautiful life and a reminder that you don't have to live a long time to make an impact, Jenna.
Absolutely. I was watching that video earlier today, and she made Simon Cowell, of all people, choke up, and she had an impact on him and just millions of viewers.
That's saying a lot.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for watching. We hope to see you back here tomorrow.
Have a great night.